In the first 15 days of 1942, the world changed in ways that still shape our lives today. But what secrets lie beneath the surface of history's pages? From covert operations to pivotal decisions, January 1942 was more than just a chapter in the history books. It was a fortnight of decisions that would decide the fate of nations. Join us as we dive deep into these 2 weeks, uncovering stories of bravery, strategy, and intrigue that shaped our modern world. Stay tuned as we unravel the mysteries of early January 1942. This is history, like you've never seen it before. The United Nations. The first fortnight in 1942 saw things turn from excitement and zeal to focus and perseverance. Despite the optimism, the fight was far from won. Japan continued to advance in the Pacific, and Germany was locked in a devastating engagement with the Soviets. The formality and focus are most exemplified in the Declaration of the United Nations, signed on January 1, 1942, by the Big Four: the US, the UK, the USSR, and China. The next day, January 2nd, 22 other governments added their signatures. Notably, these included the British Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and the British-appointed Indian government. It also incorporated the 8 European governments in exile and 9 Central American countries. Based on pre-existing agreements like the League of Nations and the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, the newly formed United Nations was to be the primary legal relationship between the Allied countries. It established key principles and objectives, such as what the post-World War II world would look like, prevented individual countries from pursuing their own agreements with any members of the Tripartite Act, and how the separate peace between the West and Soviet East might look. The initial declaration did have a few weaknesses. For example, France was left out of the picture. However, the French government signed before the war ended, along with 20 other countries, mainly from Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. The formation of the UN would have lasting impacts on the remainder of the war. It would go on to become the worldwide organization it is today. Pacific Front. While the United Nations gathered steam, the battlefield looked very different, especially in the American-occupied, non-independent Philippines. On January 2nd, the same day most countries signed the United Nations Declaration, Japan fully captured Manila, the Philippine capital, along with its Cavite naval base. Before this day, Manila had been declared an open city. Meanwhile, on the Bataan Peninsula, the piece of land across the Manila Bay from Manila, Japan continued to push American troops further and further back. A few days later, on January 7, 1942, the siege of Bataan Peninsula, otherwise known as the Battle of Bataan, began. It would last for 3 months and ultimately resulted in a Japanese victory and one of the heaviest losses of the Pacific War for the U.S. The Japanese advances continued elsewhere. On January 8th, Japanese forces pushed through the outer defenses at Kuala Lumpur, Malaya, modern-day Malaysia. 3 days later, on January 11th, Kuala Lumpur fell. The day before, on January 10th, Japan declared war on the Dutch, paving the way for their immediate invasions of Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, both controlled by the Netherlands. The dominoes were falling, and everything was coming up Japan. North Africa. The British Army had experienced significant successes in North Africa in the fight against Rommel, the Panzer Division, and his allied Italians and Italian territories. Advances had commenced in November 1941, had peaked in December by pushing Rommel all the way back to El Agheila in Libya. However, on January 5, 1942, Rommel received 55 tanks and a wealth of extra supplies. The reinforcements were put to good use and hidden, ready for a counterattack later in the month. At the same time, the bombing raids never relented. Malta, a tiny island situated in the middle of the Mediterranean, had been the focus of British reinforcement and Axis attacks for years. It held such strategic value that neither side was willing to let it go, despite the British considering its defense almost impossible, and the Italians seeing invading the island as too risky. Their Regia Marina was unlikely to see success against the Royal Navy. In January 1942, the Luftwaffe began dedicating more resources to supporting the Italian raids on Malta. The Italian and later German air forces attacked with such regularity and firepower that it's estimated Malta was one of the most bombed locations of the entire war, even more than London during the Blitz. Mainland Europe. Meanwhile, the citizens of occupied Europe watched with interest and torrid expectation as the German war machine stalled in its campaign to take Moscow. Despite steamrolling through the enemy during the warmer months, the Germans were ill-prepared for the freezing winter temperatures. They lacked warm clothing, logistics faltered, supplies stopped coming, and troops froze to death. This break allowed the more hardened Soviets time to regroup. The Russians had experienced significant losses defending Moscow until the counterattack, led by General Zhukov, picked up steam in January 1942. Slowly but surely, the German lines were forced to pull back. This time represented the first time the Soviets had halted Hitler's advance and pushed back against them. It was a turning point in the war, one from which the Wehrmacht would never recover. In the middle of January, European governments in exile, mostly based in London, drafted and produced legislation to hold war criminals to account in their occupied countries. Rumors and evidence-based stories had reached the allies of the horrific atrocities committed by the Nazis and their co-conspirators. Most ominously of all, on January 16, 1942, thousands of Jews were deported from the Lodz ghettos in Poland to the Chelmno concentration camp. They would not be the last. U.S. home front. As mentioned in our previous video, the American wartime economy was already very much up and running. Armaments were churning out of factories, aid was making its way across the seas, and volunteer troops were pouring into recruitment centers. In early January 1942, Roosevelt promised more aid to Britain, including planes and soldiers, with the Lend-Lease Act, a military aid proposal presented to Congress. In short, Lend-Lease would allow the Americans to supply its allies in the United Nations for free, on the basis that supporting the war effort would benefit the United States anyway. The British received most of this aid package, with a substantial sum also going to Stalin and the Soviets. Lend-Lease was formally passed in March 1942. After the war, Stalin's successor, Khrushchev, paid homage to the vital aid brought by Roosevelt's Lend-Lease Act. Just imagine how we would have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin without American transport. Without U.S. food supplies, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army. He also wrote that Stalin had previously said, if we had had to deal with Germany one-to-one, we would not have been able to cope. This time effectively ended any air of neutrality the Americans might still have had. Non-interventionist policies were cast aside. The Americans were now fully involved in Europe as well as the Pacific. This buoyed everyone into action. Most dangerously for American citizens and sailors, it gave the Germans freedom to move on their positions. The second happy time began on January 14th. Also known as the American shooting season to German submariners, the official declaration of war between Germany and the U.S., plus Roosevelt's blatant support for Britain and Russia via Lend-Lease, meant U-boats now had the freedom to attack any American vessel, including those along the U.S. eastern coast. The second happy time lasted from January until midsummer. This period was a disaster for the Allies, resulting in over 600 lost ships carrying over 3 million tons of supplies. German U-boat captains nicknamed Operation Drumbeat the second happy time because American cargo ships were so poorly defended against their attacks. Their prey was virtually defenseless, in part thanks to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, Admiral Ernest J. King, who refused the British offer of well-drilled, well-equipped escort ships, something the Americans were severely lacking at these early stages of its war involvement. With the undeniably active presence of the U.S. on both the European and Pacific fronts, the stage was set for the deadliest, most wide-reaching war the world had ever seen. Despite initial Japanese advances, changes to American policies and legislation meant the might of the world's strongest economy would soon be put to task. Although the situation looked bleak, Germany and Italy were stuttering on the Russian and Mediterranean fronts. After the first 2 weeks of January 1942, it was only a matter of time before the powers of evil were pushed back, permanently. In just 2 weeks, the world was irrevocably changed. These events set a course that would define a generation. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to ensure you stay up to date with detailed historical content like this.